Hi, this is Chris Builder from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Department of Statistics. I gave the seminar, You Can't Do That with Statistics, on January 28th, 2026 at K-State. I also recorded it like how I have recorded other presentations in my classes for many, many years using a software package called Camtasia Studio. I prefer using that because it provides more flexibility than using Zoom or something else to record. Unfortunately, though, some type of problem occurred during the recording, and so now I have a 9 gigabyte file on my hard drive that I cannot open at all. Because I know there were many people who said that they wanted to attend but could not, what I decided to do was simply record it again from my home studio. The one disadvantage, of course, is that all the questions that were asked during the seminar, we don't have a record of those here. So if anybody does have a question that they would like to ask me, please feel free to email me at chris@chrisbuilder.com. I'd be happy to answer it. So thank you. Well, thank you for coming to this presentation, and it is always great to come back to K-State. So today, we are going to start with the end. On December 5th, before a packed boardroom and after more than 5 hours of testimony by faculty, students, alumni, parents, and concerned members of the public, the Nebraska Board of Regents voted on a motion to eliminate its Department of Statistics. Here's a video of what happened.
Thank you. Now I'd like to ask President Gold to walk us through the items on today's administrative agenda.
Item 11A3 seeks your approval today to eliminate the Department of Statistics and the associated academic programs in the College of Agricultural Sciences and Natural Resources at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. The proposal is part of a budget reduction plan and is designed to achieve a savings of $1,750,000. The university will move to a distributed model for statistical training and expertise to leverage existing resources embedded across UNL. Upon the recommendation of the Chancellor and based upon previously established campus metrics, the faculty governance process set by UNL, and the NU Graduate College processes were all completed. The proposal was reviewed and recommended by the Academic Affairs Committee, and I recommend it today to you for your consideration.
Thank you, Mr. President. Is there a is there a motion to approve 11A3?
So moved.
Is there a second? Second. Motion been made in second. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, roll please.
Regent Calamari.
Yes.
Regent Wilkins.
Yes.
Regent Schroeder.
Abstain.
Regent Lacey.
Abstain.
Regent Kenny.
Yes.
Regent O'Connor.
Yes.
Regent Schaefer.
Yes.
Regent Shear. Regent Stark.
Yes.
Regent Whites.
No.
Regent Wilmot.
Yes.
Regent Clare.
Yes.
Motion passes.
This was part of $27.5 million of total budget cuts at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, or what we like to call Nebraska UNL. Of these cuts, $6.74 million of it were from the elimination of departments. In addition to statistics, there was educational administration, textiles, merchandising and fashion design, and earth and atmospheric sciences. Now, these cuts were on top of $75 million of other cuts that had been done the previous 5 years. So, how did this happen? And that's what we're going to talk about here today. But before we get going here, I do want to point you to my website, saveourstats.com, which documents the struggle that we've been through. So, the Department of Statistics has been in a vulnerable position, and to help understand that, we need to go back to its forming in 2003. The reason why the Department of Statistics came about is because the distributed model for statistics at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln was not working. What the distributed model means is that small groups of people on campus do statistics. And so the two groups that actually had individuals with PhDs in statistics at this time came together and merged. One group was from the College of Arts and Sciences, One group was from the Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources, or IANR for short. This is like the College of Agriculture at K-State. With this merger, these programs already had MS and PhD degrees, so those came with it. And their first new hire in 2003 was me. Fast forward to 2018, and INR said, we want all of you in our college. And so what that meant was for myself and a few others who had tenure homes in the College of Arts and Sciences, we all moved over to INR. Then in 2019, INR says, we want you to start an undergraduate program. But when you put together the proposal, make sure you do not indicate that you need new faculty for it, because if you do, your proposal most likely will be rejected. But don't worry, because we've got your back. Resources will come. So a committee of faculty in our department put together just a really innovative undergraduate program, and it was approved in fall of 2020. And one of the innovative aspects of it was the number of credit hours taught by stat faculty that these undergraduate majors would need to take. It was 51 credit hours. All these credit hours were brand new courses that we needed to develop. And to compare that 51 number to what other departments of statistics did for the undergraduate program, you can see this plot on the right, where we have required stat credit hours taught by stat faculty on the y-axis, number of faculty in the department on the x-axis, and in 2020, you can see that Nebraska was essentially an outlier compared to these other programs. And at that time, I also calculated, well, how many new faculty would we need to actually implement this undergraduate major? To do it comfortably, we would need about 7. Then in 2022, we had our first undergraduates start the program. In 2024, the number of faculty that we had was about where we were in 2020. But we were able to do an external hire for our new department chair, and we were promised 4 new faculty positions. But then in fall of 2025, we're still at the same number of faculty. We were having a very, very difficult time offering our bachelor's, master's, and PhD programs because of it. So you can see that the Department of Statistics was in a vulnerable position. But the University of Nebraska-Lincoln has also been in a vulnerable position for some time. And perhaps one could trace this back to when we joined the Big Ten in 2011. With the Big Ten came big goals. We were the smallest public university by far in the Big Ten when we joined. And so in 2017, Chancellor Ronnie Green, the person who would actually run the university, said the following: our realistic goal for us by 2025 is to enroll 29,000 to 31,000 students on our campus, and then an aspirational goal of 32,500. INR leadership said, hey, we better prepare for all these new students. Let's hire new faculty now. In 2020, we got a new University of Nebraska system president by the name of Ted Carter. He implemented some really good ideas, but in the end, that actually ended up hurting us some. One of these ideas was the Nebraska Promise, meaning that every family that made under $65,000 per year, their corresponding kids would get to go to UNL for free. Faculty salary increases were done to help us get a little bit closer to our peers. And undergraduate resident tuition and other, tuitions as well, were not increased a whole lot in comparison to some other universities. But Carter left. He left for Ohio State in 2024 to be their president. And in 2025, our enrollment was 23,954. So you might be thinking, well, you got all these great ideas, all these grandiose goals, but your number of students hasn't really gone up. In fact, it's actually gone down. How are you paying for all this? Well, that's where that $75 million of budget cuts come into play. So in spring of 2025, the university needed to go to the state legislatures and say, how much of an increase we needed in our annual budget. The university said we need 3.5%. The governor said, well, how about a negative 2%? They compromised at an increase of 1.25%. On March 4th of 2025, then our chancellor, Rodney Bennett, said, well, we got to start our budget reduction process once again. And so he gave that job to his executive leadership team, or ELT for short. I'll be using that abbreviation a lot here today. And he said, when you do this budget reduction process, use performance metrics along the way. Now, the ELT has 6 members, and here's a screen capture from this fall of their webpage showing who's actually a member. And many of these members have something in common. At some point during this budget reduction process to come up with a plan, 4 of them were interim. Also, another one was looking for a job, and he was hired by Penn State in November. So the university was also in a vulnerable position. On September 11th of 2025, the ELT met with the faculty in my department and told us that we are being proposed for elimination. During the meeting, Tiffany Hang-Moss of the ELT said the following, and so the Department of Statistics, based upon these quantitative metrics and qualitative considerations, has been proposed for elimination. Then just a few minutes later, she says the following too in the same meeting. I don't know how you are a comprehensive R1 land-grant institution without having a presence in statistics. A few minutes later, the dean of the Agricultural Research Division followed up with, I struggle. As Tiffany said with respect to teaching and learning, how a land-grant R1 university can then be a comprehensive university and succeed in its mission without statistical expertise. Well, the faculty definitely agreed with that statement, but we couldn't figure out then why are you proposing to eliminate us? So on September 12th, it went public, the proposed elimination. And also a little bit more information about what would actually replace us with something called the distributed model. This is the same idea of what was at UNL before the department was formed in 2003 and was shown then it did not work. This is what the distributed model meant to the ELT this time. There would be 5 remaining courses where these corresponding courses relative to what K-State would have. You would have 3 introduction to statistics courses, a course on like regression analysis, and an experimental design course. Also, there will be some consulting capacity that would remain as well. And as far as we could tell, this meant that there would be one person who would do all the statistical consulting needed for the entire campus. All faculty then, after we saw that, we're basically saying you can't do that with statistics. And for those faculty who hadn't been at UNL as, let's say, as long as me, they were saying, wait a second here, tenured faculty can't lose their jobs. Unfortunately, I've been at UNL long enough to know that actually they can't. And so here's how. This comes from the University of Nebraska Board of Regents bylaws. And they can lose their jobs for one of 4 reasons. 1, for adequate cause, like maybe you do something illegal. 2, for retirement, which makes sense. 3, for a bona fide discontinuance of a program or department. And then 4, for extraordinary circumstances because of financial exigency. Basically meaning the university is essentially bankrupt, they need to cut. Well, the Board of Regents would never ever declare financial exigency because that would look really bad and faculty, staff, and students would just be leaving once that would occur. And so what the ELT focused on was this bona fide discontinuance. Now, probably what was really meant in the bylaws to put that in there was, situations such as, let's say, maybe a major is just not popular anymore and a department's having a hard time actually getting people to major in their program. Maybe in that particular case it would make sense. Maybe we do need to eliminate the department. But this was by far not the case for the 4 different departments that were eliminated. They were thriving. Now you might be wondering, well, could something similar be done in Kansas? So I looked it up for you. In the Kansas Board of Regents Policy Manual, on page 59, item 6BI, you have very similar language to what we see above. But when the program discontinuous part is mentioned, nothing about bona fide. So the bona fide program, a program discontinuous doesn't even need to be bona fide here in Kansas. But in Nebraska, how do you make it bona fide? This gets back to what Tiffany was saying when she said that we were being eliminated. It's the quantitative metrics and qualitative considerations. Really, the focus was on these metrics, and so that's what we'll talk about here. So metrics are just another name for statistics. In order to calculate a metric or a statistic, you're going to need data. And so that's what we're going to talk about next. But before we do, I need to give credit where credit's due. I need to give credit to the statistical detectives in my department, Susan Vanderplas and Heike Hoffman. They're the ones who first took a look at the data, took a look at the statistical analyses performed by the ELT, and they were the ones who were first discovering the problems with them. So some of the ideas of what I'm going to present here originated from some of their work. So a common theme for the departments that were proposed to be eliminated was that the data are not correct. And we heard this over and over and over again. So to give you an example, Heike, shortly after our department was proposed to be eliminated, Heike said, let's have all the faculty look at their research contributions and compare them to what the ELT says the research contributions were. And so if you just scan through this table here, you're going to see some differences in the 2 columns there, the ELT column and the correct column, which is what I have found. So in case I didn't say this before, these are, this is my data. And so let's just look at one of these here. We'll look at books. The ELT says I did not have any books during a particular time frame when in fact I did write a book. So what happened? Well, they have the year that my book was published recorded incorrectly. That's why. But there's other ways that a faculty member, one in a department of statistics, can also contribute with respect to research and also instruction. In particular, they can win a university award. We have a faculty member who won an award for being the best teacher amongst the entire University of Nebraska system of 4 different universities. But the ELT did not think that was important enough to include in any kind of metric. Also, for statisticians, we are often co-investigators or consultants on grants. At least for the ELT, you had to be a PI for it to be important enough to be included in your records. Statisticians often write software such as R packages for the statistical software package called R. Again, not important enough to include in any of the metrics. So once the ELT got their data, they aggregated across faculty for a department, and so that they could eventually have metric scores for the department as a whole. And so then a question comes up of, well, which faculty do you include in the data for a particular department? You maybe think that's simple, but in the end it was not. So we're going to look at an interval of time from 2014 to the end of 2023 and see who was in the department. And so on the y-axis of this plot, we have the actual faculty members that were there. On the x-axis, we have time, the year. And if we just take a look at my entry here, you can see a red line that goes across the entire plot. That corresponds to me being there during that entire time. Now, and also I should mention that I have a 1.0 FTE appointment in the department too. And over time, the composition of a department changes. So for example, we had a husband and wife that retired at the end of 2023. We also had an individual who left the department to become the department chair at another department of statistics. And then we have people that leave for other reasons. We also have people that start in the department too. Okay. So between 2014 and the end of 2023, you see all those red lines. You would think that any research contribution done by these faculty would count towards the overall research contributions of a department. In the end, that didn't happen. Instead, the ELT did the following. Only individuals who are currently in the department can actually have a research contribution included. Also, they have to be tenure track as well. And so what you can see here are the red lines indicating the actual years of contributions by faculty to any research metric. So ELT said that we had 13 faculty, and this was over 10 different years. So that means we have 130 different faculty years, say, that can be used to correspond to research contributions. For us, in the end, only 61 of those 130 years counted, so about half. And then because 2 of our faculty had significant administrative appointments at that time, meaning that they're probably not going to be able to do as much research as normal. Perhaps you could even go as low as this. About 1/3 of the possible faculty years actually counted towards our research contributions. The end result, as you might expect, much lower research contributions than actually occurred is what the ELT used to measure us. So to put this in a little bit easier perspective to think about, here are the books that were written by faculty during this particular time period. And you can easily count that there were 5. The ELT counted just 1. Okay, so now let's talk about the statistical analysis that was performed by the ELT, what was wrong with it, and also how it could have been done better. In order to start talking about the statistical analysis, though, I have to assume that the data are actually correct, which they're not. And if your data is not correct, then of course you just got to stop. You shouldn't even go to the statistical analysis part. But for me to continue in this presentation, I need to assume that the data are correct. So the ELT came up with 16 different metrics to compare departments. All were converted to a z-score. So let's review what a z-score represents. So this would be like from, again, an introductory stat course. If x is a random variable, maybe like for a metric, with a particular mean that will denote by the Greek letter mu, and a particular standard deviation that will denote by the Greek letter sigma, then the z-score is you take x, subtract off the mean, divide by the standard deviation, we'll call that z. Then the way that we interpret these z-scores is simply the number of standard deviations that axis from the mean. So one of the big places where z-scores are used are to detect outliers, meaning unusual values of x. And you could say if z is outside of plus or minus 2, that might be an outlier. I prefer not to do that. I prefer to go all the way out to z being outside of plus or minus 3 to be more safe. Also, what z-scores can be used to do is to compare multiple variables on the exact same scale, such as your number of books and number of citations. While they're both a count, you can imagine there's going to be a lot more citations than books, so there's quite a lot of differences in those numbers. But by converting it to a z-score, you take away those differences essentially, so you can make direct comparisons. So in August of 2025, the ELT gave us our metrics. They were divided into 2 different parts, research and instructional. And you can see, again, there are 16 different metrics here, so let's just talk about a couple of them. Books, negative 0.56. Completion of majors metric. What this represents is how good are you at graduating your students? Negative 1.38. This particular z-score was the farthest from 0 of all of our metrics. Again, the purpose here for the ELT is to be able to compare the different departments. It's always important to have in the back of your mind. Now, to make it easier for the ELT, they decided we're going to average across all the research metrics and also average across all the instructional metrics. The problem with doing that then is that basically you're giving an equal weight for all the research metrics and also for all the instructional metrics. And that's a problem because departments, disciplines weight certain kinds of contributions, typically higher than other kinds of contributions. And that totally takes that out of the equation then in terms of how you assess a department. More on that shortly. Now, of these metrics, 9 were negative, but none were outside of plus or minus 2. And that's something that's important, as we were talking about outliers before, because that's usually the number one thing that a statistician would look at when given a number of z-scores. How many of them are outliers? And we can see that none are. Also, I should mention, while you can obviously see that there are 9 of 16 that are negative, for some reason the ELT always said 8. We were not going to argue with them on that one, and so we'll call it 8 from now on. And so when we saw these metrics, half are negative, half are positive, none outside of plus or minus 2, the Department of Faculty were like, okay, there's really nothing to worry about here. This is not unusual. Also, before I move on here, I want to mention that none of these calculations were reproducible by any of the departments. The ELT refused to release the full set of data so that they could be. Now let's look at one of those research metrics more closely, the Scholarly Research Index, or SRI. This is a proprietary metric from academic analytics. Our z-score was a positive 0.55. Now what the SRI measures is the overall research contributions for a department. But it also weights each of the individual contributions that go into this overall weights them by the importance for that corresponding discipline. So for example, for statistics, books had a weight of 5. And we can see that's a lower weight than these other contributions because most faculty actually don't ever write a book in their entire career. Now, what's interesting here is that SRI, again, is an overall measure of research contributions. And so perhaps, that could be used as just the one and only metric, although it's not perfect, the one and only metric to evaluate departments. Instead, what the ELT did was that they had in addition to having awards here, they actually had their own separate awards metric. In addition to having books here, they had their own separate books metric too, which doesn't make any sense. So going back to now May 15th, Mark Button of the ELT, for the first time, talked to program leaders, department chairs to discuss the metrics that were going to be used. He also said, keep this all secret. Do not talk to your faculty about this. So the general faculty didn't actually know until August. And one of the documents that was discussed during this meeting was a document by someone by the name of Jason Casey, who basically was part of their data analytics group that helped the ELT get the data and analyze the data. And in the document, Casey says the following about these z-scores. Neither positive nor negative z-scores carry any interpretation other than the distance from the mean and the standard deviations. A negative score does not imply that a unit does something poorly, nor does a positive imply the opposite interpretation. As a statistician, I can live with that interpretation. Yeah, that's okay. Then in October, each of the departments that were slated for elimination had to give a presentation for the Academic Planning Committee, which was one of the shared governance entities that needed to vote. Should we accept what was in the proposal or say no, don't eliminate? And at the very beginning of each of these presentations, someone from the ELT would read a statement into the record about why the proposed elimination should be done. This is similar to, let's say, at a court trial when you hear the charges read aloud for a defendant. And this individual from the ELT, for we look at educational administration first, said the following. Educational administration is one of the lower performing units by UNL metric analysis for instruction and research. The unit was negative on 7 of 9 instruction metrics and 6 of 8 research metrics. This is the only justification given for this bona fide discontinuance. This kind of interpretation was the first time that we are also hearing about this. And it goes totally against what their data analytics group said about how to interpret these metrics. Again, you can't do that with statistics. Now, the reason why I didn't show you what was read for statistics when we had to do our presentation was because this individual likely just forgot to include the number of negative metrics in his statement. But don't worry, it's actually included on the next slide. So in October as well, there were 2 graduate councils that also needed to vote relative to discontinuing the corresponding graduate programs of these departments. And to do this vote, they were given just a single one-page document by the ELT for why they should vote to eliminate. The part of the document that focuses on statistics is shown here. It said, instruction, negative on 4 of 9 metrics. Research, negative on 4 of research metrics. There's also something else about outliers as well, and we'll talk about that shortly. Then in the December 5th meeting of the Board of Regents, the only thing that was given in their materials for why you should vote for elimination was basically a statement very similar to what we saw for the Department of Educational Administration. So for statistics, negative scores on 4 of 9 instructional metrics, negative scores on 4 of 7 research metrics. So the ELT did not want to release the metrics for every department, did not want to release that to the general public too, in addition to not releasing enough information to make everything reproducible. But eventually, the metrics were leaked, and so we can look at them more closely. So we're going to look at now the awards metric. This separate metric from what the SRI used for awards, this separate metric only included the National Research Council highly prestigious awards. Here's a histogram of the Z-scores for all the departments at UNL. In the end, there were only 8 unique values for Z across these departments. And 87% of these Z's were less than 0. So what that means in the eyes of the ELT, 87% of the departments at UNL were underperforming. That's a poor metric. Now let's go back to talking about this instructional outlier again. This was for completion majors, it was a value of negative 1.38. It's not outside of plus or minus 2, so it's not an outlier. However, the ELT decided to invent their own new definition of what an outlier is. This is directly from their document. Note, outlier for this purpose defined as plus or minus 1 Z-score may not align with a statistical definition. You can't do that with statistics because for over 100 years, we've understood what these Z-scores represent. We know what an outlier is, and to be outside of plus or minus 1 is actually quite common. But let's take a closer look at this completion majors metric. What it was the number of graduations for a department divided by the number of majors for that department for the 2023-24 academic year. This number then is converted to a Z-score. Now, if you remember at the beginning of my presentation, I talked about how there was a new undergraduate statistics major that just began in 2022. So for this particular academic year, 23-24, the oldest students in our major were just sophomores. They contributed to our number of majors, but there would be no way that they could contribute to the number of graduations because they only had been there up to 2 years. That's why we had a negative 1.38. And what really makes this all worse is that the ELT, they knew that. And I have documentation that they know that. And they never, ever gave that context that I just did now. They never gave that to any of the entities or the groups, the committees that had to vote on eliminating the Department of Statistics. They never knew that, or at least given that information by the ELT. So next what we're going to do is talk about what perhaps is the worst problem with how the ELT approach examining these departments. And it goes back to these z-scores once again. But we're going to change things up. I'm going to explain this problem in a more statistical way first. And then I will explain it in a non-statistical way as well. So let's let x sub I now be a random variable with a mean of mu sub I, standard deviation of sigma sub I, where we have I equal 1 to n, meaning that we have n of these different x's. Our goal is to compare x1 to x2 down to xn. And so what we can do is calculate a z-score, which is exactly the same z-score as what we see above, but now we use the subscript I. And what we want to do is compare z1 to z2 down to z sub n. So the question of interest then is, well, what do you use for mu sub I? What do you use for sigma sub I here? Well, naively, what you could do is simply find the mean of all the observed values for x1 through xn. Do a similar thing with the standard deviation. This is wrong because each of these x's have a different mean, and you will screw up what these z's are, and the comparisons that you do here will make no sense. Now let's attach some meaning to what x sub I represents. Let's let it be a metric for department I. And what the ELT did was exactly this. They formed a grand mean over all the x's, did a similar thing for the standard deviation. You can't do that with statistics. So now let's talk about a non-statistical way to talk about what the problem is. And what we're going to do is talk about dog shows. So at the end of these big dog shows that you see on TV, you have a part called Best in Show, where they want to find the one dog overall that is the best dog. And so for this particular dog show in 2024, we have, for example, here Monty the giant schnauzer. We have Vito the little pug dog as well. And what they need to do at this end of the show is decide which of these dogs, which are fundamentally different dogs, meaning that they're from fundamentally different breeds, which of these dogs is best. And the way that they make that judgment is that they examine the dogs relative to the standards of their own breed, meaning that they're compared to other dogs in that same breed. So Monty the giant schnauzer is only compared to other giant schnauzers. And the dog that is the closest to that standard is then Best in Show. So to look at this further, suppose we make things simple. Suppose size is the only characteristic of interest to determine which dog is Best in Show. And let's say the bigger the better in terms of size. If the ELT were the judges here at the show, how they would have approached the problem was that they would have saw that Monty the giant schnauzer is the largest, so they are going to award that dog as Best in Show. They don't care that there's differences amongst the breeds. That's the problem that essentially we faced at UNL when they were comparing the different departments. But the way that what the ELT actually wanted to do was not find which is the best in show, but instead, what is the worst in show. And using this criteria that I just told you about, the larger the better, well, poor little Vito here, the pug dog, would have been the worst in show, and he would have been cut. And just for your information, because I'm sure you're curious, Vito the pug dog actually was best in show this particular day. So how could we approach this the correct way then? Well, there is a way that you could do it with z-scores, but I'm going to skip that to save time. Instead, I'm going to examine a better way to do this, and that is to basically draw on classical non-parametric statistics where ranks are used, or we can look at it in terms of percentiles as well. And so to use percentiles is basically a two-step process to compare these departments. Step one, find the percentile of the department of interest within the same discipline across all universities in terms of the ranking of that department. So for example, if we look at the SRI for the overall research contributions for a department, the UNL Department of Statistics is at the 75th percentile, meaning 75% are worse, 25% are better departments. What this translates into, if let's say the number 1 represents the best department, the UNL Department of Statistics is ranked 39th out of 158 different departments of statistics. So once you do that for all departments out there, let's say at UNL, then what you can do is compare these percentiles across the entire university to determine which is, let's say, best in show, which is worse in show. So let's actually try to do that. So what I have up here is a plot of the SRI values for R1 departments of statistics. There are R2 and R3 departments as well, but just to save space here, we're only, in the plot itself, only going to look at the R1s. And they're divided up into two different parts, this plot. The top is for the Association of American Universities members, which the AAU, which is a more elite group of these R1 schools. And in the bottom are the non-AAU schools, which includes UNL and Kansas State. It's important to note that UNL, for a number of years, has made it a top priority, almost an obsessive priority, to get back into the AAU. We were kicked out about 15 years ago. So we can see that UNL has a SRI value of about 0.4. And if I were to project up into the AAU plot, don't worry about the different colored dots there. If I were to project up, we can see that UNL kind of fits in the middle of those AAU schools. And for a university that wants to get back into the AAU, it makes no sense to eliminate a department that actually would make your university look good. Now let's take a look at those blue dots. So this is a comparative group of universities that you would, let's say, naturally think that UNL would fall in. This particular comparative group is a group of universities that the Husker football team frequently loses to every single year. And again, if we were to project up into this plot, you can see how UNL fits very well amongst those blue dots, that comparative set of schools. So once we get the percentile rankings for a particular department, then what we can do is do that for all departments, and we could plot it. And that's what this is shown here. It's kind of small, so what I'm going to do is zoom in on the top and zoom in on the bottom so that you can see the different departments better. So here we go. So here's statistics. Remember, they were at about the 75th percentile, so that's why you see them there. Statistics is ranked 17th amongst all UNL departments. The best is communication studies, which is about, I think, at the 96th percentile. And also what we see here is perhaps something that's alarming. So the red dots correspond to the departments at UNL that the ELT originally wanted to eliminate. And you can see that 4 of the top 17 departments were slated for elimination by the ELT. That's not a really good way to run a university, to eliminate your best departments. Let's look at this a little bit more closely. We'll look at comparing the Department of Statistics to the Department of Physics at UNL. And so using the ELT z-scores, we can do a histogram of all these z-scores for the citations metric. And you can see how physics just really stands out in comparison to all the other departments. It's by far the best, according to the ELT z-scores. Statistics itself is about, I think it was a negative 0.19 or negative 0.09, and you can see where it falls to. Now, if we were to look at the data the right way, our understanding of this comparison totally changes. Statistics is the 79th percentile of all statistics departments. Physics is the 40th percentile. So they're kind of a middle of the road department of physics relative to other departments of physics across the country. Statistics is actually better than physics when you look at these percentiles. And well, why does this happen? Well, it just comes down to the culture, the nature of the discipline for why this happened, that physics just simply has a lot of citations. That's how they do their work in comparison to, let's say, statistics. So now you might be wondering, well, didn't you talk to the ELT about the data and the statistical analysis problems that you found? And the answer is, oh, yes, we did. Between September 16th and October 10th, we talked to them at least once on 15 of those different days. But when we told them about the problems, they didn't believe us. So then we started to, in October, say, okay, if you don't believe us, then let's get an external independent review by PhD level statisticians then. But they would never respond to us directly regarding that. Then on October 30th, I invited the ELT to participate in a campus seminar where they would present their case and the Department of Statistics would present our case. The ELT declined. Well, we went ahead and gave that seminar anyway on November 6th. And we had about 200 people from the UNL community actually attended. If you want to see a recording of it, go to saveourstats.com. So let's talk a little bit more about shared governance. We've already seen these votes here. By far, the Academic Planning Committee was the most important vote. And it's important to understand who was in that committee. It was faculty, staff, students, and administrators, including 4 from the ELT who actually put together the proposal to eliminate the department. The faculty on this committee asked the ELT to recuse themselves from voting. The ELT members refused. Now let's take a look at some of the comments from the councils and the committee. So each of these groups had to write a report or write a letter summarizing their deliberations and why they voted a certain way. It's important to understand that no comments supporting elimination were included in these documents. Here's what some of the comments were in the end. We found no evidence that any of the affected graduate programs meet the standards for deletion established by graduate college bylaws. In terms of metric validity, significant concerns have been raised that have not been addressed. Before proceeding, an independent verification of data and methodology is essential to ensure the Regents' decision rests on accurate and defensible information. In the end, none of that mattered, because on November 10th, Chancellor Rodney Bennett finalized his budget reduction proposal, and still on there was eliminate the Department of Statistics. The next step was to go to the Board of Regents. As you might imagine, faculty were quite upset, and they still are right now. On November 18th, for the first time in the history of the university, the Faculty Senate voted no confidence in the Chancellor, and the vote was overwhelming. So now we're back at where we started, which was the end. You've already seen what the final vote was. What actually counted was a 7-1 for elimination vote because there are some student regents as well on the board, but their votes don't count in the end, even though that they do vote. And as I mentioned also, there was over 5 hours of testimony from and it was 109 different individuals where we all had 3 minutes and we will all stand at this podium to address the Board of Regents. There was 24, let's say, direct supporters of statistics who went up to the podium there, and I put together a video that shows all their testimonies. And for those of you who are statisticians, and if you have time, I recommend that you watch that video. But whether if you're a statistician or not a statistician, if you can, look at the video, look at the testimony corresponding to speaker number 2. This testimony was from Alex Vanderplas, who's the 9-year-old son of Susan Vanderplas, professor in our department. He was testifying not just for statistics, but also earth and atmospheric sciences too, because he likes rocks. He likes dinosaurs. His testimony is quite moving. I think it really helps the general public to understand the devastation that we feel relative to our families at home and also our families at work. But especially for those of us who are in the Department of Statistics, the devastation from the ELT misusing statistics to eliminate the Department of Statistics. Isn't it ironic, don't you think? On January 5th, the Chancellor resigned. For resigning, the Board of Regents gave him the following. They decided to pay him the remaining $340,000 on his contract and also $1.1 million more for leaving. And everyone signed non-disclosure agreements. So, could this happen here at K-State? I hope not, but here are some thoughts about how to prevent it. Get to know your Office of Data Assessment and Institutional Research. These are the people who have the official data of the university. Make sure their data is correct. Make sure they can do correct statistical analyses with that data. Size matters. Money matters. It's much easier to eliminate small programs than large ones. We were actually able to show that that's what happened at UNL. Always look for ways to increase your number of majors and your revenue. Try to be more efficient. Encourage your department faculty to be part of shared governance. Be administrators. In my department, we have 3 individuals who are part of shared governance, and that really helped us. And lastly, insist on faculty experts in fields that can help with a budget reduction process. Insist that those faculty are actually taking part in the process. Insist on data correctness. Insist on calculations being reproducible as well. Okay, well, thank you. That's the end of my presentation.